So the topic is doing research. This is what we're going to talk about, and again, those of you with handouts, you have the same handouts with the slides. Those of you who came, the handouts are over there. Please pick up the handouts. Good. You can follow the Armenian version in the handouts, okay? All right, so it's a workshop, so you expect it to work. Not just sit, yes, and listen. Very good. So we're going to cover these things briefly. What is research? How we understand why we do research as teachers. We're going to think about typical problems you have as teachers in your classrooms. We're going to try, as part of methodology, like steps. We're going to define a problem, then define a focus, think of a methodology quickly, talk about issues of reliability and ethics, and how to present results. Okay? So, just quick overview. Okay, so here are some questions for our consideration. So teachers might, this is so awkward for me to be standing like this. Maybe this is better. Okay, so for example, a couple of questions for our consideration. What are successful teaching strategies in inclusive classrooms? Okay, so that's one question we could consider asking ourselves, yes, as teachers. Or how inclusive are classes in our schools? Question is, how can we address these questions? How can we answer these questions as teachers? Two ways, usually, how we can answer questions. Typical problems in our classrooms as teachers. So one way is that we read the literature. For example, for this first one, what are those strategies? I think it's easiest way to do that is just go and read the literature and find out what other people have done on this topic, their research, ideas. We call it secondary research. So what it takes is just reading and paying attention and taking notes and learning from that and then implementing in your classrooms. Second way, we can answer a question that is a teaching related question, is to collect our own data, we'll call it. Collect our own evidence, we'll call it, yeah? So first-hand, primary research. I think this idea here was, so I have students, how are they performing? How are they feeling when I do certain strategies in class, yeah? We'll call it primary research. So this is secondary, based on somebody else's work. This is primary, based on our own work, our own data that we collect from our own children. So these two things I think very important to highlight from the very beginning. Here's a question. How inclusive are classes in our school, for instance, yeah? So we can do that with first-hand information, data. Here's a few ways you can consider. Again, in your handouts, those of you who came earlier, you have that translated into Armenian. Ask a close colleague for her opinion. So you could say, our classes are, well, inclusive or not. You could have a chit-chat over coffee. That's one way to do that, maybe. We could ask a few parents that I know very well. Yeah? Yeah, maybe a few parents. We all as teachers have better connections with certain parents. Could ask a few parents that we know. We can anonymously survey all students in the school. Anonymously, you understand? You don't ask for their names. You ask all students, and you can anonymously ask for their opinions about, are our classes inclusive? You could also have teachers observe each other using the same observation form. The same things you're paying attention to. So the question is, which of these ways you think is going to give you most reliable, trustworthy information? the answer to this question, that is.
The last two.
The last two? You agree? Last two as well? Why?
They are relatively more objective.
Last two are objective. But also, as you think, it's inclusive. Includes a lot more people in your community, in your school, not just a handful. Yeah. So when we do first-hand research, primary research, oftentimes to pay attention to what kind of information will give us most reliable answer. Yeah. Okay. So briefly, this we call anecdotal evidence. First two. Anecdotal, it doesn't mean it's funny, you know, I know the Russian word anecdote, it has nothing to do with funny. Anecdotal means it's just personal, isolated experience. Okay, so, it's okay to rely on this, but I don't think we can make solid decisions based on that. It could just lead us to certain hunches. This is primary research. This is what we're looking for. This is better quality, okay? Okay, so why we do research? So what do you see here? Now this is not translated. I will ask Nektar to translate. This is called self. This is here a t-shirt with self. This is peer. This is student. This is theory. This has to do with the idea of reflection. Yeah, I think what you mentioned is all related to that. Thank you. This has to do with the idea of reflection. Now, this is a mirror. Yeah, I don't know if you have noticed that. It's a mirror. So she's looking at the mirror, but she's also wearing different shirts. I'm self-reflecting. Versus I'm doing peer reflection. So you are all here peers. You can ask each other, you can observe each other, you can provide reflection to each other. It's peer reflection. This is student reflection. You can ask students to provide reflections. And this is theory. You're reflecting on theory, research that has been done on the topic. How is it connecting to what I'm doing, all right? So oftentimes we'll call it action research in teaching. Is a reflection tool. It's very important to do research as teachers because it helps us grow. It's a professional development tool, okay? And it doesn't have to be fancy. So action research is becoming very popular now. There are journals that publish action research papers. And because now we understand as a field that this is a powerful transformational instrument. So I'm sure all of you have several problems that bother you, that you wish you could solve them, and then your teaching would dramatically improve, yeah? So, as we proceed, this handout that you have, again, not all of you have a copy, but I invite you to, for example, take a photo for you to take notes in your own notebook. I invite you to follow through because at the end you may actually end up with a very simple plan of action that you can go back and implement in your own classroom, okay? So let's move on. So you have a problem. This is very simply how you define your focus in the process, yeah? And reason I put it here, it's not linear. It's not linear. You keep going back and forth and you keep refining and you keep redefining your problem oftentimes. You identify your problem at one point, which is what we did right now, but it could be very fuzzy at the beginning. Then you might read, I would say if needed, related literature. Usually it's helpful because you may discover answers to your questions have been found, or at least from different other contexts.
Or identify the factors that contribute.
Exactly, you can identify factors or how they did that. You can find also answers to that. So you could learn from others, yeah? You could do secondary research. Then you pose a research question. Now, unlike the problem that you stated, a research question has a question mark in the end, yeah? Yeah, a question mark. So this is very simple model of how you refine your focus, yeah? So back to the same research question. So how inclusive are classes in our school? As you may have noticed, I expanded it beyond For example, my own class, or the whole school, which is also possible with action research. So we want to this is something we've done already. So I'd like to invite you to look at this chart in your handouts. We're talking methodology right now. This is a very simple explanation of research, obviously. People spend hours studying it, but this is only one slide here. Look, this we call instruments. Yeah, instruments. For example, a written survey. So you can give out surveys to students or parents or whoever. They may have closed-ended or open-ended question. For example, closed-ended, how much do you like the textbook that we use? And then answer choices. Very much, not much, very little, I don't like it. Answer choices. It's closed-ended. You just mark it. It's called closed-ended. Open-ended is you just ask a question. What do you think of the textbook? And students have to write the answer. Open-ended, yeah? So written surveys can be with open-ended questions, with closed-ended. You can do observations, yes? Very similar to, familiar to you as teachers. You can interview, or you could do focus groups with your parents, with your teachers, students, okay? You can do tests and quizzes, yeah? And you can do student papers or presentations. So these are tests and quizzes, oftentimes multiple choice, usually we think of them. But these are papers where they produce stuff that is more like creative type of work, where they could present, yeah? So these are examples of instruments that we could use to collect data, we'll call it, for the action research. Now, I'm asking you here to think of, put a check mark here. Is this qualitative or quantitative data? And what it means in this case is, at the end of the day, when you collect this data, are you going to have numbers?
Some of them.
Or will you have just words? So when you have numbers, it's quantitative. When you have words, it's qualitative. Yeah, that's a very simple way of explaining it. So you want to just write qual, quant, sometimes both. I'll give you one example. So closed-ended will give you numbers. Yeah? Because multiple choice gives you numbers. You can rank them. For example, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 numbers. You can average them. Open-ended will give you qualitative data. The rest of it, I suggest you fill out here yourself. And this column here, is this piece of data going to actually give you information about student learning? Based on this data, will you know students have learned something or no? Does it make sense? Here you want to say yes, no, yes, no. I'll just quickly, ideally, of course, I would invite you to share your thoughts, but so many of these can be both qualitative and quantitative data. Depending on the questions, exactly. Now, most obvious qualitative is probably student papers and presentations. Here you will have some qualitative data. Most obvious quantitative is probably tests and quizzes where you'll have just numbers you'll have to crunch, yeah? Right? Observations oftentimes qualitative, interviews oftentimes qualitative, but again, it depends on the interview. You may have the instrument. You may have the instrument where you have numbers, a scale of some sort. Which ones of these instruments are giving you evidence of student actual learning? Student's product gives you evidence of student learning. Okay, so for example, student papers or presentations or tests and quizzes, observations, if you're observing students' performance, surveys, interviews are also good. They give you a different perspective, but these are oftentimes opinions. And opinions will not necessarily give you evidence of learning. Students think they're learning, but they're not. Students think they're not learning, but they are. So it's very important to use different pieces of evidence to arrive to a more reliable conclusion, okay? So that's the bottom line of this. So complete task number 2 in your handouts. Time is short, so I'll just zip through this. So this is a summary of a methodology for this research question. It's a different research question. How useful is homework for my students' learning? Have you ever asked yourselves this question?
You mean general homework or type of homework?
Your homework. But this is a very good question you're asking already. Yes. Because there is a lot of research that says usefulness comes from the kind of homework you give. And a lot of research suggests that most of the homework is useless. So interesting action research project, by the way, especially in Armenia. I'm a father of 2 children, and one of them goes to a local school. Okay, so here's what we could do. We could do, this chart here is a summary of the methodology. Who are my participants in my study? Who and how many? For example, I want to ask parents. There's 28 of them I have students 28. What could I do with them? I could use the following instruments. I could do a written survey, have them fill out a survey for me. I can also survey the students, but also I'm going to look at their grades, right? And how and where am I going to collect this data? End of the term, when I have the PT's parent-teacher conference, so they come, I ask them to fill out, I collect. Okay? With students, I will ask them on a weekly basis simple little questions about their homework, opinion about homework, and at the end of the term, I'm going to look at their report, the grades. You know? And what is this here kind of data? How am I going to analyze it? This kind of data that I collected. I'm going to use means. Means is average, arithmetic. Как называется по-русски? Среднеарифметический. Yes. I can do means of the grades or of the written survey if it's any closed-ended questions. I'm going to look for repeated themes, opinions in those questionnaires for open-ended questions. Yeah? What is repeating? Yeah? What adjectives or words? And I'll use graphs also to make sense of my data. Here's an example. Again, this slide here, I'll come back to this if I have time. Here's an example of my answers, results, yeah, to this research question about homework. For example, I ended up collecting 24 responses instead of 28 from the parents. I may discover that students spend anywhere from half an hour to 3 hours per week on homework. Per week, yeah. I may discover from parents that they think that homework is important and not sufficient. Yeah, I may discover that from parents. Students, I may have 25 out of 28. And I may discover that they say, oh, I spend 1 to 4 hours of homework every week. You see the difference? I may discover that they say, homework is useless and boring. Yeah, that's what students may say. I may also look at since I'm going to look at their grades, I'm going to look at the relationship between the time they spent on homework and the grades that they have received. Is there a relationship? So the kind of thing I could do also that is more quantitative. And I could present it in a graph like this, yeah? So here the blue is 1 hour they spend. Orange is they spend 2 hours a week. This is kind of brown, 3 hours, and yellow is 4 hours. So this can actually show me it grades. What are the grades, yeah? On the scale of whatever the scale is here. It's supposed to be on 10. Oh yeah, 10. In Armenia we have 10. So I used out of 10. So the grades that they have received out of 10 is their relationship between time they spent on homework and the grades they receive. Yeah? So something like this can also help me interpret the results. Okay? And then I pause and think. So what does this really mean to me? Do I need to change my practice? Yeah? And essentially, this is the cycle that I'm engaged in all the time. I teach, I engage in my practice, I self-assess. That's your action research happening here. Then I look at the results, I consider results of your action research, and I close the loop. Based on the results, I may decide to change. And I practice again, and I keep going again and again as part of my reflective practice as a result of action research.